Hello, my friends. Welcome. Good morning, Jesus Love. It is Mother's Day. It is Sunday, May 10th, 2020. I'm so sorry, church family. I've been trying for the last 45 minutes to get Facebook to stream live like I've done the last 6 weeks, but just had so many technical difficulties. So here we are on YouTube, and I'm going to, again, do my sermon here, and then I'll post it up to Facebook. And if you're watching this, you already know that. So God bless you guys. I'm so happy to be here. So good to see you. And again, just technical difficulties aren't going to stop us from moving forward. My name is Jimmy Chemist. I'm the English ministry pastor here at Jesus Love Korean Church. We are located in Temecula, California, about 8 years old. Just had our 8-year anniversary. I've been with Jesus Love almost 3.5 years. And in that time, our church in the English ministry has grown from about 10 people to a number of families and upwards of 50 individuals when the whole English ministry is together. If you're looking for a church home, again, we are absolutely grounded in the grace here at Jesus Love, in the grace of Jesus Christ and His power to save His people. And we are committed 100% to the exposition of the Scriptures, to biblical teaching, and we believe that God transforms His people, again, through the teaching of the Word and through communion, through fellowship and through communal worship and all those other means of grace that God pours out His love to us. And so here we are. Every Sunday we meet at 11 o'clock. In the last 7 weeks, this is our 7th week, last 6 weeks, we've posted on Facebook Live, and again, next week we'll be right there. If it's a recording of a video, but hopefully we'll be live. All the technical difficulties will be worked out. We're in the third week after Easter. We've started a series on Christian vocation, on the idea of calling in the Christian life. And we've talked the last 2 weeks about what vocation is. We'll review a little bit of that today as well. As well as the arenas of vocation. And last week we talked about the first arena, meaning area of our life where we have a call or a vocation as a Christian, and we talked about the primary calling, which is in the family. Before we get to vocation in full, I want to say Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. It's so frustrating not to be able to gather in person, to be able to thank you for everything that you do. My mother, my wife, my mom Kathy, my wife Kelly, Happy Mother's Day to you guys and all the other moms out there. We appreciate you, we thank you, and one day is not enough. But I wanted to, again, talk real quickly about motherhood. Usually we'll do, the last few years, a special sermon on motherhood, and we'll do some of that today, but it's not going to be my entire focus. We're going to continue talking about vocation, but before we get to that, I want to talk about Mary, the mother of the Lord, and her call to vocation and how she lived that out. I was just struck this week as I thought about the circumstances of Jesus' birth. His mother is a teenage girl who is betrothed to marry a man. She is in a people group, the Jewish people, who are subjugated and under the thumb of a very brutal empire in the Roman Empire. She is from a small town called Nazareth, which barely appears in the historical record. It's just a tiny, small village. And most likely Mary's father betroths her to marry Joseph at an early age, and maybe as young as 14, 15 was pretty common in those days, to a man because of the financial strain that another mouth to feed put on the family. And so Mary is thrust into a situation. We don't know much about the betrothal to Joseph, but we do know that Mary, very shortly into that betrothal, before they've come together in marriage, is found to be with child. Now, we know that miraculous child is the very Son of God, the creator of the earth that He was born into, that He came to save His creation. But people from the outside in that culture, just like today, what they see is a younger girl who is pregnant and she is out of wedlock. In every way, for Mary, this is a unplanned pregnancy. I wouldn't say unwanted. She, when she's told, the song Mary, Did You Know? When she's told by the Archangel Gabriel what she would do and what her child would do, she very clearly accepts this role. And so I wouldn't call it an unwanted pregnancy. She is blessed among women, but she has this call in her life that isn't something she had planned for. In the midst of her everyday life, probably very little that would make it stand out, she is called to this radical vocation to be the very mother, to bear the King of the world in her womb and to give birth to Jesus of Nazareth on Christmas morning. You guys that know me know I think Christmas morning is the most important day in human history. In fact, I believe the entire universe was created so that Christ might be born. Now you might be saying, what about Easter? He came and was born so that he could die and be resurrected. So there's no doubt about that. But I just wanted to highlight that a vocation is not necessarily a career path, and it's not necessarily a commitment to a church life, and all of us have a vocational call, even the young Mary those 2,000 years ago, and that call, that vocation required suffering, required that she be misunderstood, it required that she would be stigmatized, but it also provided just incredible blessing, an overwhelming blessing to the rest of the world. And so on this Mother's Day, all of you mothers, I thank you for the gift of life, for the gift of love that you give. For most of us, when we think about the most selfless love that we've experienced in our life, it comes from our mothers. And watching my wife pour her life into my son and into me is just an overwhelming blessing. So mothers out there, appreciate it. We talked last week about the vocational call to family, and I just want to thank you all for you moms for everything that you do for us. Doesn't go unnoticed. Last week, again, speaking of vocation, I want to give you just the word vocation. If you haven't heard, if you haven't joined us, if you're here for the first time, it's the Latin word for calling. Excuse me, take a drink. Yes, I'm drinking a Mountain Dew. Sorry. We're after noon now, so no more coffee. Almost noon now. But the word vocation is the Latin word for calling. And the main idea is that when we became Christians, when we believed, when we heard the gospel preached, and for the first time put our faith in Christ, that was God literally calling us, addressing us personally with the language of His Word. Maybe you've been in a room where the gospel is preached, and not every person in the room is moved to make a decision or to come to faith, but some people are, and my experience was just like that. It was this powerful call of God in my life. And so He called me first into a relationship with Him and brought me to faith. And then once you begin the journey of the Christian life, you realize the Christian call is a call not just to have faith, but then to live a life of love, to be, as Jesus said, that they will know you by your love. He said, just as I have loved you, you must love one another. And so when the world sees the selfless love of us Christians who are called out of the darkness, out of non-faith into faith, we then, as an act of worship to God, here's our call to love our neighbors as ourselves. The verse we've been using to frame our discussion of vocation is 1 Corinthians 7:17. Let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. 1 Corinthians 7:17. The Lord has assigned a life to us and called us to that life. People don't like assigned, right? That sounds like a sovereign God who has power, and obviously He does. None of us, choose our parents or where we will be born or the family we're born into. None of us choose the era, the nation, the region, the culture that we are born into. And so when we come into the world, God in a very real way assigns a life to us and calls us to live that life a certain way and to love our neighbors as ourselves. I love that idea, again, that the Lord assigns a life to us and then calls us to that life. Just beautiful. All right, again, we've been talking about the definition. Let's talk about the three arenas, again, in quick review. We are called to live a life of, I would say something, Bob Goff, the author, says that we should love everyone everywhere. I think that's a good summary of the call in the Christian life, but that everyone everywhere has as we started to talk the last couple of weeks, has strata or concentric circles. And the first arena last week we covered where we are called to love our neighbor as ourselves, to live out our Christian vocation, is in the arena of the household. As mothers and fathers, brothers, sisters, sons and daughters, grandparents, we all have a calling to love our neighbors, and our family and the household are our closest neighbors. We talked about the fact, the reality that not every parent is one that entered into marriage and then planned children, that sometimes we have a family member who passes away, unfortunately, and we have parenthood thrust upon us. Some of us in the teaching, coaching vocation often have students and athletes who don't have great connections with their own fathers, and it's an amazing blessing to be able to play that sort of a familial love role, even with people that aren't our family. And so many of us, we have this call to people within our own family relationships. So much of Christian ethics, so again, not an overwhelming amount, but we looked at Ephesians 5 and Colossians 3, where the very overarching call is for Christians to live lives, and usually those ethical admonitions, calls to the Christian life, begin in the home. Fathers, love your wives as Christ loved the church, right? We know that. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, and this picture of husband and wife and family united. Again, there are not individuals tyrannizing other individuals within a family. It's a structure, a living unit. Beautiful thing. Then last week and into this week, we'll begin to talk about the other two arenas. First, the home. The second would be the church. All of us as Christians are called to be part of the universal church, capital C church, all believers that have ever lived. But we also have a call to serve and unique skills and talents to serve within a local community body as well. And so here at Jesus Love, it's just awesome to see the skills, the talents, the different abilities, and that all of the members of our church bring to the table. Not every part of the body is an eye. Some are feet, and again, this idea that all of us are made unique. We have individuality, but we're called in the church to be one body. And then the third arena where the Christian is called to love and serve, we talked about the last couple weeks, is the state or the culture that we live in. And each of those cultures has a unique set of circumstances and calling. And so the Christian called to love will look a little bit different in each and every household. The Christian called to love our neighbor as ourselves might look a little different in each church. And the Christian call to love our neighbor as ourselves will certainly look different at different cultural points in history in different nations. The call to the Christian in Germany in 1933, which we'll talk some about today, is not the same exact call of the Christian living in the United States in the South, let's say in the 1850s, or the Christian living in China in 2020. Those Christians have the same call to the home and to the church, but their call to their local culture and to the state that they live in is going to look a little different. So today we're going to talk about this idea, and it's been true for me, and I'm going to use the example of one of my heroes of the faith, a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I've mentioned him a number of times. I want to read a little bit about him and tell you a little bit about him and how his life played out. The doctrine of vocation, as we said, was developed in response to this idea that to be a Christian called and on mission meant you checked out of life, and committed yourself to celibacy and poverty and to the authority of the church. And I think it's a much healthier view of vocation to see that every single potential job is an avenue to live out our true calling, which is, my calling is not just to teach or to coach. My calling is to love my neighbor as myself, and teaching and coaching and pastoring are just avenues God has called me to. Again, I want to talk about vocation. I just mentioned 3 jobs I have. I'm a teacher and a football coach and a pastor. I actually just took on working a little bit in another avenue as a consultant. This is going to sound strange, for a video game. I have a friend who's a video game developer, and he wants to make a Christian video game, and he's actually asked me and hired me to consult on it to make sure the theology is good. And I never would have thought that God could have called someone like me right? My passions when I was young were football and theology and video games and history, and I love to read, but I thought maybe I should do something else with my life to serve the Lord. But those passions, those skills, those areas that I have areas of endeavor that I've stepped into, God has used all of those areas, football, to be a ministry, to love my neighbor as myself. My church ministry is not one of just preaching, right? It's a call to a whole nother family of people to really love them. And even the world of video games, which many would say has no redeeming value at all, the idea that God would allow me to work on a game that might get the gospel out there to people that have never heard it before is just so incredibly humbling. God truly assigns us to a life and calls us to live into it. When I'm out on the football field or teaching theology or interacting with students or doing a chapel or preaching on Sundays, it is an amazing feeling to know. And again, I don't want this to sound like I'm bragging, but there's been so many times in my life where I felt and knew that I was not in the right place at the right time, that I knew something was off. And whether it was when I was in law school or certain jobs that I've had, I just knew that I was not in the right place. And it's a great, great blessing to know that you are being used. And again, that's the Christian calling, not to a certain job, but to take the skills that we have and love like Christ did in all the arenas of our life. Again, the idea is the priesthood of all believers. You don't have to be a priest making sacrifices in the temple in order to please God. You don't have to be a priest or a nun to have a vocation or a pastor. That all of us are priests. All of us have the ability to offer our lives as sacrifices. Vocation shows Christians how to live out their faith, and not just in the workplace, but especially not in the workplace, specifically the family, the church, and in the culture we live in. It really is where the rubber meets the road. And so, again, those three arenas of the household, and today we'll talk a little bit about church and state. Again, the last thing I want to say, and before we get moving on today, is this idea that when we are living in our vocation, when we are really living into the call to love one another, to love our neighbors, it is God Himself working through us. We don't have the ability as humans to agape in that way. Agape is the very love of God. It's a sacrificial love that costs something. It's an action that costs something and is to the benefit of the beloved. It isn't a feeling or an emotion. And so when we live into our true agape love vocation, this call to do and act and to love others in a way that truly benefits them, not to feel a certain emotion or to, again, this is where we get the nonsense of people saying, I love her, I'm just not in love with her, and, or I love him, I'm just not in love with. This kind of love is a choice, and I think it's a choice across the board. And when we live into that vocational call to love, it's God Himself doing it, and we are like a mask. Martin Luther said that vocation, our calling, is like the mask of God. It looks like us doing it, but the reality is we are the hands and the feet, the very body of Christ, who is the one actually working. Okay, love you guys, and if you've spent time with me, I often mention Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I was raised Lutheran. I come from a long line of Lutherans from Montana, where my grandmother actually spoke German in the town she grew up in, Newtown, North Dakota, right on the Montana border. And so I grew up very Lutheran, baptized in the Lutheran church as a young man, and I've seen these sort of Lutheran ideas of work play out in my family life and vocation. And I wanted to mention, again, a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And I really, truly believe that part of our vocation, and this will be the focus for today, is living out of the gospel. We've been saying that, but to meet the specific needs in the culture that we live in, right? So as we think about vocation in the broader society, I want to talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. If you're interested in a great book, I'm going to quote extensively from it. The author of the book is Reggie Williams. He's the assistant professor of Christian ethics at McCormick Theological Seminary. And he wrote a book called Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, Harlem Renaissance Theology and an Ethic of Resistance. Again, if you're interested, the author is Dr. Reggie Williams. He's a professor of Christian ethics at McCormick Theological Seminary, and he wrote a book, it's only 140 pages, called Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, Harlem Renaissance Theology and an Ethic of Resistance. Again, that may sound like a lot of verbiage, and I don't want this to be difficult. When I refer, to Dr. Williams, to Reggie Williams, this is the book I'm referring to. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a German Lutheran minister growing up in the 19-teens and 1920s in the wake of World War I. As a German growing up in the wake of World War I, and again, Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a theological heavyweight, very popular today, and a biography of Bonhoeffer was written a few years ago by Eric Metaxas, went to the top of the bestsellers list. Christians of all sorts find Dietrich Bonhoeffer to be a great inspiration. Conservative Christians claim him because he was a great critic of liberal Christianity that he experienced, and liberal Christians love to claim him because of his experience with the African American community. What experience, right? So let me tell the story. Dietrich Bonhoeffer comes in his early 20s to the United States, to New York, to Union Theological Seminary. And so this German Lutheran pastor, a young man wanting to be a pastor, comes to New York, and he enters Union Theological Seminary. You may know Union Theological Seminary. They're famous this year for one of their dean of the entire seminary, saying that anyone who believes in bodily resurrection is essentially uneducated or believing in fairy tales. So this seminary, Union Theological Seminary in New York, is extremely liberal. Even in Bonhoeffer's day, he's famous for critiquing how few times they actually mentioned the gospel in his years there. But one of the things that he did is he lived in Harlem, and he made good friends at university with a young African American man, and was invited into his home, and over the course of that year attended an African American church in Harlem, and was exposed to the realities of segregation in the 1930s in the United States, and the Jim Crow laws, and the brutality of racism as it appeared. And for that reason, Bonhoeffer will then return from the United States in New York back to Germany in 1932. 1 year later, Adolf Hitler comes to power. And again, if you look at the German Christians of the day, we have a lot of great heroes, men like Karl Barth, who wrote the Breden Manifesto rejecting Hitler's teachings. But of all the Christian leaders in Germany at that time, Bonhoeffer is the one who grasps the horror of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime and their racial policies from the beginning. Bonhoeffer stands out as this voice of someone who recognized the evil of Nazi racial theory and the way that it could play out. Again, in 1933, very few people are recognizing that. Bonhoeffer does. In 1933, Hitler is elected to the parliament with a majority vote, extremely popular, turns around the German economy. And so the shame of the German Lutheran Church and the other churches at the time is the number of them that were more concerned with issues of theology, which is concerning, right? I love theology, rather than the suffering of the people around them. And Bonhoeffer's voice stands out. And there's no doubt, and that this book that I'm referencing, The Black Jesus, Bonhoeffer encountered not a white European Jesus that was being presented all over the world that justified things like imperialism and overt racism. But Bonhoeffer himself had experienced real racial prejudice in the United States in that single year. And when he comes back to Germany and he encounters the racial policies of Hitler, he receives this incredible call. And if you know the story, Bonhoeffer will speak out publicly against Hitler. He will stand up and eventually take part in an actual attempt to remove Hitler from power. For that action, Bonhoeffer will be arrested and he will be executed in 1944 in a concentration camp in Berlin. And that calling to lay down his life, to stand up, was something he came to understand by being a member of a church in the United States, and specifically an African American church. So I'm going to read you some excerpts from the book and give you just a few minutes. You may have heard Martin Niemöller's famous First They Came For litany. It's sketched out in a typical pattern that this is the kind of thing that happened in Hitler's Germany of the 1940s. You've heard this before, I'm sure. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Next, they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And I know you've heard that again. That is Martin Niemöller's famous litany about people, not seeing a call to stand up for those around them. And it's overwhelming. Many people, I'm sure you have as well, have wondered how a Christian nation like Germany, I say Christian in air quotes because a country can't be Christian, but people can be, but a modern European Christian nation could enact such brutal, racist, violent, over-the-top, sadistic behaviors is one of the great questions of history, explaining Hitler and the Nazis. I think it's really, let me be careful, a childish view to think that Hitler manipulated a whole nation of people. I think a better, more accurate way to think about it is they worked together. The people of Germany needed to hear that Germany was strong, that they would be united, that they would be restored. And the people wanted someone to tell them the things Hitler told them. It's a symbiotic relationship. From the beginning of Hitler's rise, Bonhoeffer realized that Jesus of Nazareth, and that if you look at the context of Nazi Germany, and I hope you don't disagree with me, but on that context of a oppressive state, the Nazis are going to destroy 11 million people in concentration camps. 6 million Jews, but also homosexuals and Jehovah's Witness, and the Roma, or the Gypsies as they were referred to, but the Roma people with mental disabilities, people of all kinds, and of course Jewish people, 11 million. 40 million people die in the war itself, maybe more. But when Hitler targets socialists and trade unionists, and the Jews, and the Gypsies, the Roma, and homosexuals, and the intellectually challenged, and every other substrata that the Nazis targeted, Bonhoeffer seems to be the one who realizes that Christ was on the side of those people. Christ was not the state power that was destroying those lives. Think of this. You had Christian SS officers running concentration camps. Right? It seems that Bonhoeffer, because of his experiences in the United States and the experiences with the suffering of the black church in particular, Bonhoeffer immediately recognizes that Christ is on the side of the suffering, not on the side of the ruling power that is doing the tyrannical dictatorship, right? It seems so obvious to me. I know it does to you. Karl Barth, the primary author of what's called the Barmen Declaration, if you're interested, is a theologian who took a bold stand against the Nazis, and he wasn't alone. Many Christians did. But if you remember the litany, there was no one to come for me. The Confessing Church, these are all of the German pastors who had sided with Hitler, was more concerned with what the Nazis were doing with theology and less concerned about the incredible suffering of the non-Christian victims. Right? Maybe you're sitting there saying, what do you mean Christ is on the side of the homosexual? What do you mean Christ is on the side of the Jew? What do you mean isn't he on the side of the Christian? And this is so difficult, right? Because we grow up in a society and in a culture that essentially has what we would call a theology of glory, that we see God's will played out in the social structures. And this theology is used to justify why Europeans, for example, would set up empires all over the world, in Asia and Africa and the New World, right? Set up colonies. Why you would have this expansion of European dominance all over the world and the subjugation of other races. And so I think, to me, it's just so clear that Christ came to suffer for those and to suffer in the place and to identify with those. Not a theology of the glory only of God. I believe in God's glory, obviously, But I think a better theology, and the one Luther pointed out, is a theology of the cross. That when we see the cross, the Son of God not sitting on his throne, pounding people into submission, not ruling over other peoples because he's more talented, evolved, higher and superior. No. What does Christ do? He identifies with the lowly. He identifies with sinners and tax collectors and prostitutes. He identifies with the racially discriminated against in the Samaritans and many other occasions. Professor Williams, again, in his book, it's just a fantastic book, Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. He makes a very good case that Bonhoeffer understood the Nazis because he viewed Germans and the Germans in that day through the lens of the American black theology that he had learned while in the United States. And I'm going to fill that in the details there. The book is not just about, again, The Black Jesus by Dr. Williams is not just about Bonhoeffer's theology. Oftentimes theology gets separated out from real life, and I believe in a practical theology where what we know about God should move us to live and to love in our vocational call. Dr. Williams, in his book, The Black Jesus, he said he started thinking about the roots of Bonhoeffer's Christianity when he was taking a class by Dr. Alfred Smith at Allen Temple Baptist Church in Oakland, California. Here's what Dr. Smith said. He said, African American spirituality is a spirituality that was born and shaped in the heat of oppression and suffering. Smith told his students, blackness in America is a metaphor for suffering. To know blackness is to be connected to the suffering, the hope, and the purposes of black people. He says, Bonhoeffer came to know blackness when he was a Sloan Fellow at Union Theological Seminary in New York during 3031. I know there's a lot of ideas I've tried to bring together, so I want to just rehash real quickly. We have a calling in our life to love in our family. Bonhoeffer did that. We have a calling in our life to be a member of a church. As a young man, when he comes from Bonn, Germany, all the way to New York City in the United States of America, he finds himself not in an aristocratic white family or an upper-class family, but he finds himself living in Harlem amongst the African-American church. And he came to understand something that a German living in the 1930s in Germany could never have understood, that the threat of what Hitler was presenting, that it had a potential for overwhelming evil. And Bonhoeffer saw that because he had so seen the horrors of racial discrimination here in the United States. So Dr. Williams in The Black Jesus argues that the gifted theological wonder kid, that's what he calls Bonhoeffer, had a totally German worldview when he arrived in New York. So it's not that Bonhoeffer always had this love for people of color or for people who were under subjugation, or at least discriminated against greatly. Injustice is a better word. But Germany, if you remember, had been humiliated in World War I. The treaty that ends World War I blames the Germans essentially for the whole thing and has them pay massive reparations to their enemies, $50 billion to France, and it just destroyed the German economy. And so when 1929 happens, 10 years after the war, and the Great Depression hits, there are literally pictures and records of Germans living in caves, of Germans eating bark from trees, and it's overwhelming the amount of poverty and despair that was thrust on the German people. And so when you look at the German Christianity of Bonhoeffer's day, of the early 1930s, the kind that is going to allow someone like Hitler to come to power, it really is an expression of Christianity in Germany that is really a nationalistic, very social Darwin, the idea that the German people had evolved, that they were in some way blessed by God. And so the Christianity of Germany in Bonhoeffer's day, and Bonhoeffer has the same view before he comes to the United States, is really wrapped up in the language of racial purity and blood and a pure German people. It's hard for us to understand. Maybe you've heard times when white Southern slave owners in the United States, for example, would stand up in the pulpit and use the Bible to justify their ownership of their brothers and sisters, right? And this overwhelming reality that played out in the United States. And so in Germany, you have a Christian nation, right? But the Christianity is one that is going to help produce a Hitler. It is focused on German blood and German superiority and gods and a German white Jesus. And that's really the strangest thing. European theology was the production of what Dr. Williams calls a diseased social imagination. The infection occurred when theology was merged with the colonial system. And Christianity, as you guys know, was used as a justification for domination of other peoples. The United States, again, the genocide of Native American cultures in the United States, for example, some of it by disease, much by slavery and violence. But it's possibly a greater genocide in terms of numbers than Hitler committed. And so one of the great sins of the United States, no doubt about it, is that Christianity, whether it was Christopher Columbus, using Christianity to justify his destruction of native peoples, or it was white slave owners using Christianity to justify slavery, right? It's the same sort of thing. And so Bonhoeffer becomes aware, he lands in New York City during what's called the Harlem Renaissance. And if you've ever heard of a number of authors, we'll look at a few of them, but one of them, W.E.B. Du Bois, you may have heard of him, just a wonderful poet. He says that there was a color line, and it was a direct result of this idea that Jesus was a white man. By the way, I keep saying Black Christ. Jesus is a first century Palestinian Jew. He certainly isn't a European white man. And there was actually a lot of discussion and dispute over this. A lot of the German Renaissance masters like Albrecht Dürer would paint Jesus looking a lot like them. A blonde, blue-eyed German Jesus. And this idea, that Christ did not come and become one of the lowest. I mean, who finds the empty tomb? We talked about this 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago. It's Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene is a Palestinian Jewish woman. She's a woman of color. Right? She finds the empty tomb. And who is the risen Christ? He's not a European white man. It just makes me want to laugh. But we've all seen images, and I think it's fine all over the world. People, whether it's in Asia or in Africa, identify Christ with them, and I think that's wonderful. And the point of the book is not that Jesus was African or had black skin. It's this idea of Jesus coming to suffer with oppressed peoples, not coming to rule on earth as a king. That was actually one of the great misunderstandings. Christ will certainly rule, but he takes his throne by what? Laying down his life and suffering with the lowest, not with conquest in the way the world thinks of power. Again, Dr. Williams argues the project of theology in colonialism was split. It was primarily doctrinal and conceptual, lacking content for Christian conduct. That split was necessary to justify the domination of foreign people that accompanied classifying human beings by race, securing the advantages of whiteness, and accommodating the practices of colonialism. In Bonhoeffer's Germany of 1930, Germany had all of their colonial possessions in Africa taken from them. And so Germany felt like they had been specifically targeted. Nazi ideology, in other words, was an expression of this European white sort of, I don't want to speak about race. It's not where I want to be today. But this idea of a self-centered theology that makes Jesus like me, rather than seeing that, and again, we all can say that Christ did come and take on flesh, and he did live a life and go through all the things that all of us went through. But I hope we can see that rather than coming and justifying and giving power to all the systems in the world, Christ actually came to flip the world upside down. And some people call the kingdom of God the upside down kingdom, right? The last are first. There is no distinction on race and gender and social class. All are one, united in one body. And again, so this idea of like a white European Jesus becomes part of the muscle or the power structure that again, colonialism, imperialism, nationalism are all part of that mix, even in the United States. On February 23rd, Ahmaud Arbery, An 18-year-old African-American man was jogging in Brunswick, Georgia. And he had no drugs in his system. He had not committed a crime. He had not committed any crime, let alone a felony. And when Ahmaud Arbery, 18-year-old African-American man in Brunswick, Georgia, on February 23rd is out jogging, and he jogs by the home of two individuals, a father and a son, who believe that he matches the description. That phrase has been used so many times to target people of color, but they believe he matches a description of a burglary suspect. So the two men, you may have seen the video, it's all over. These two men get in their truck, they arm themselves with shotguns and pistols, they drive in front of Ahmaud Arbery, they park in the road, and they set up a bit of a roadblock. When Arbery approaches them, they pull their weapons. He tries to flee, then they pull their shotguns on him. He tries to grab the shotgun. The video is brutal. 3 shotgun blasts can be heard, and Ahmaud Arbery was shot dead. That was February 23rd. Charges were not brought until this week. That's March, April, complete months, right? And then 2 more weeks into May. I thought a lot this week of Ahmaud Arbery's mother. And I thought about my call. And I'm sorry if you've been turned off because I'm talking about race. But when I think of the call in this country right now to the Christian, right, what is my vocation? What is my calling in this culture that I live in? I'm not an elected official. I don't have the power to initiate massive change by force. But I can speak truth, and I can speak words of grace and mercy and hope, and that's what I hope to do. And I was thinking of Ahmaud Arbery's dead today, and his mother lost her son this week. For what reason? Because he's a black man. And these two men felt that they had the right to pull a shotgun on him and demand that he stop and make a citizen's arrest. And when he was shot, it took 2 months for charges to be brought, and there are those involved with the case who say that these guys committed no crime, that they were doing a citizen's arrest. Pulling shotguns on a man who had committed no crime and trying to stop him and take him into custody, and then taking his life with 3 shotgun blasts to the chest is just so callous and such a brutal, brutal crime. By the way, they were arrested this week, the father and son, and charged with murder. The book Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, Williams believes that the white Jesus, this is not a real Jesus, by the way, of European theology, is hard for that Jesus to grasp the significance of racism or imperialism, and most significantly, the Nazi challenge to Christianity. So, only in the black church does Dr. Williams says could bear witness to the black Jesus. And he doesn't mean Jesus being African. It's not what he means. He means a Jesus who understood suffering. Bonhoeffer, as any of the students of his life, if you've read anything about him, was certainly distressed by the kind of spirituality and Christianity he was seeing in the United States. Here's a quote from Bonhoeffer. He says, "In New York, they preach about virtually everything. Only one thing is never addressed, or it is addressed so rarely that I have yet been able to hear it. Namely, the gospel of Jesus Christ. So it stands in the place of the Christian message, an ethical and social idealism born by a faith in progress, who knows how, claims the right to call itself Christian." So Bonhoeffer didn't come to the United States and say, "Oh, I finally found true Christianity." In fact, he looked at the seminary he was at, and he was very critical of how little it focused on the gospel. You guys, I've never said that he found his calling at seminary. He found his calling as a Christian and the courage to stand up in Nazi Germany when he returned home, not in the seminary that was so liberal that it really was not even preaching the gospel, but he found it in the church. And you can imagine conservative Christians love that quote that I just read, because it makes Bonhoeffer a conservative criticizing liberal theology. But if I would have asked you what the conservative element was, right? So Bonhoeffer rejects the liberal Christianity of his day. But what was the conservative Christianity? Part of that conservative Christianity in 1930, unfortunately, there's almost 3 million Americans in the KKK at that moment, right? And so there was certainly excuse me, I lost my train of thought. Let me just jump right to my notes. I'm sorry about that. In this book, again, Dr. Williams isn't suggesting that all black churches were equally adept. In fact, he talks about how many of the black churches as well were essentially promoting the same sort of white superiority. But when Bonhoeffer hears what are called the Negro spirituals, the songs that many African Americans had sung are centered around their Christian faith. I know you've heard, probably some of those. That was when Bonhoeffer hears those, that is a very different Jesus than the one that he had encountered in the Germany of the 1920s and 30s. The white theological imagination of the period was captured by this battle between different parts of Christianity. Black Christians, again, weren't wrapped up at the time in the 30s with liberal conservative tension, but about the real concerns of their lives. I don't know if you do today, and I don't know how much I would say this extends today, but if you think of the 1930s that Bonhoeffer is living in, most white liberals of that time, I don't think really saw the white supremacy that existed as a matter for Christian attention. And so when our theology gets so detached from real life and real action, I think there's real problems there. Our theology should give us a way to live in the world. That's what a vocation is, a calling to action, to do something, to love, which is an action. Again, racism may not be a part of your everyday life, but avoiding racism, especially in the 1930s, was not a choice for African American Christians. It was a matter of life and death. Right, literally thousands of African Americans are lynched and killed and brutalized, even after the end of slavery, obviously. So what was this church that Bonhoeffer became a part of? He's part of, again, a church that is he had a friend named Albert Fisher who went to seminary with him, and Charles Fisher was the pastor of a church, and Bonhoeffer was a fellow student with Albert. And so that young German Bonhoeffer could go down the street and walk right into Harlem, not because of who he was, but because of his friend. He had the ability to cross that color line. And again, if you've ever attended a black church, I did for a number of years actually. If you've ever been to an African American church, there is something different. There is a simplicity to the theology. It's often not as intellectually highfalutin, but it is practical. And it emphasizes that Jesus Christ was on the cross, at the cross, when he identified with the suffering and the oppressed. That Christ on the cross is the best picture of who he is, not this idea of the order of the ages that he's established. And again, that is part of God's glory as well, is what he's done. But its most clear picture of who he is, I believe, is seen on that cross. The book doesn't suggest that Bonhoeffer's brief time of study in America was the only influence in his later thinking. That's obvious. But he does argue, and the book's a good one, again, The Black Jesus by Dr. Williams, argues that when Bonhoeffer encountered that African American church, it allowed him to empathize with the suffering of marginalized people so deeply that when he returned to Germany, the devilish, evil, demonic spirit of Hitler's National Socialism was really obvious to Bonhoeffer. Right? Talk about being assigned and called. He found himself as a young man at a seminary in the United States that he found to be too liberal, but there he met a friend who invited him into the African American community. And while there, he saw a picture of Jesus that was so different than the people in power in Germany. If you don't like the idea of white supremacy in the United States, that language, just think of Germany at the time, which inculcated that racism into law. I mean, literally, the power of the law, what Hitler did in Germany was legal. I said that what Hitler did had legal backing. He changed the laws and put racial prejudice into the very legal system, just like the United States did in our own Constitution, which calls African Americans 3/5 of a human in the 3/5 clause, or 3/5 of the value of of a white individual, right? And so the reality is, and I think it's really clear, is that Bonhoeffer is the hero. He can act in the way he does in Nazi Germany, because God had given him that year of experience seeing the suffering of people under a racial segregation, and he knew immediately the evils of what Hitler could do. The full title of Williams' 140-page book is Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, Harlem Renaissance Theology and an Ethic of Resistance. The author, again, takes on a whirlwind tour. It's probably the best part of the book, I think, introducing the reader to the prominent members of the Harlem Renaissance: W.E.B. Du Bois, Alain Locke, Claude McKay, Georgia Douglas Johnson, Langston Hughes, and a famous poet named Countee Cullen, one of my favorites. And all of these voices, they were when Bonhoeffer's there in the 1930s, during the Harlem Renaissance in New York, they were debating and arguing and preaching sermons and anathematizing and baptizing, and this unique perspective from the unique sufferings of the African American community had an overwhelming impact on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Let me read you a poem. This is one of my favorites. Bonhoeffer quoted this in a number of his writings. It was the first time I came across it. It's called The Black Christ by Countee Cullen. She writes, "How Calvary in Palestine extended down to me and mine was but the first leaf in a line of trees on which a man should swing. World without end in suffering." Amazing, right? So there's no experience in Bonhoeffer's German life that can understand the depth of this suffering that Countee Cullen as an African American has gone through. And she looks at Calvary in Palestine, right? How Calvary in Palestine extended down to me and mine was but the first leaf in a line of trees on which a man should swing. World without end in suffering. That as an African American growing up in Jim Crow and experiencing slavery, her own parents having been former slaves, she knew what suffering was. And what Christ did on the cross at Calvary was so clearly an identification with her, right? Extending down to me and mine was but the first leaf in a line of trees on which a man should swing. Jesus was hung from a tree, and she identifies all of the brutality of slavery and black lynching, and ties it to Christ and his own suffering. That's the theology of the cross. That Christ is most like us in our suffering, in our weakness, that he comes in and he takes that on. Although powerful and the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, he meets us where we are, and he is the friend of the lowly, the friend of the oppressed. And instead, what is Germany and some elements of the United States doing? No. A theology of glory where I'm in charge and I'm in power and I have high status in society, not to use it to bless others, but because God has blessed me and in some way I'm deserving. I've taught at a couple Christian schools, and one I'm at now, Rancho, has a strong theology of the cross. It's so important. Luther came up with this distinction that the theology of the cross sees Christ in his suffering and sees the identity of Christ as the one who came to die for sinners. The theology of glory sees, and I've taught at a Christian school. It was a very wealthy school, and so many of the parents there had a theology of glory, that they were driving an Escalade and owned a lot of property and were doing very well because they lived such a good life that God blessed them. I know you hear this prosperity gospel nonsense all the time, that God came to give you wealth, this is Joel Osteen every weekend. I'm not picking on him by name. I guess I am. But my intent is not to be divisive. Joel Osteen's very encouraging, but he straight up says in an interview on Larry King that he has never said the word sin in church. Right? How do you have a theology of the cross that really understands Christ came to save sinners, Paul says? That's a worthy saying, worthy of full acceptance. Christ came to save sinners. And yet there are pastors in this country who teach to thousands every weekend about how God made them and wants them to have financial blessing and never feel pain and to have good relationships. And Jesus had what? Immense physical pain. Brutal relationships, betrayed by friends and family. Right? And then he suffers a brutal death under intense persecution. Christ lived the perfect life. And it wasn't one of sitting in glory and thanking God that we are not made like the lowly. Christ became the very lowly. He was born to a woman of color who was having an unplanned pregnancy and was literally under the boot of an oppressive regime. That is the mother of the Lord. Bonhoeffer referenced that poem. Let me read it again. County Cullen's Black Christ. How Calvary in Palestine extended down to me and mine. She finds Christ in her suffering. Was but the first leaf in a line of trees in which a man should swing, rolled without end in suffering. Bonhoeffer referred to that poem, The Black Christ, by County Cullen, in his writing, and we know that he had subscriptions and followed the leading figures in the Harlem Renaissance. He read regularly Crisis Magazine, which was the official magazine of the NAACP, and he often read Opportunity Magazine, which was the official magazine of the National Urban League. And so his 1 year of experience, Bonhoeffer, in this church, sets him on a whole life calling and path, and little would he know, it prepared him to stand off against one of the most evil men in history. Here's a quote from Dr. Williams' book. The practice of joining in with African Americans in Harlem gave Bonhoeffer the ability to see more clearly the distinction between a damaging theology of glory, represented by a white Christ, who refuses incarnation and empathy, and the healthier theology of the cross that reveals the presence of God in suffering. I couldn't agree more. Williams suggested that Bonhoeffer, again, Williams is the author of the Black Jesus book. Williams suggests that Bonhoeffer learned as much from the disdainful young voices who rejected the white Jesus as a hopeless cause as he learned from those like George Douglas Johnson who embraced a Black Jesus. Again, here's another author from the Harlem Renaissance. This is a poem by Georgia Douglas Johnson. So sorry. Georgia Douglas Johnson. Listen to this. Come, brothers, lift on high your voice. The Christ is born, let us rejoice. And for all mankind, let us pray, forgetting wrongs upon this day. He was despised, and so are we. Like him, we go to Calvary. He leads us by his bleeding hand through ways we do not understand. Come, brothers, lift on high your voice. The Christ is born. Let us rejoice. Shall we not to the whole world say, God bless you? It is Christmas Day. Right? That is, again, Harlem Renaissance poet Georgia Douglas Johnson. And again, this idea that, what does Christ say? Pick up your cross and follow me? If you would be my disciple, you must lay down your life, pick up your cross, and follow me. And what does Georgia Douglas Johnson say? Like him, we go to Calvary. He leads us by his bleeding hand through ways we do not understand. Christians are called to live in the world like Christ did. Right? Like Christ did, laying down our lives for those around us, not ruling over because we have been chosen and elected by God and placed in a position of power. The church that he was a part of in Harlem was called the Abyssinian Baptist Church, and he really lived those experiences of an exceptional congregation living in really hard times in the Depression in Harlem. Here's a letter from Bonhoeffer about what he said. He said, every Sunday at 2:30 in the afternoon, and together with my friend Albert, and often as his substitute, I had a group of young people in the Sunday service. I conducted Bible study for some Negro women, and once a week helped out in a weekday church school. Hence, not only did I become well acquainted with several young Negroes, I also visited their homes several times. The personal acquaintance with Negroes was one of the most important and gratifying events of my stay in America. That's Bonhoeffer in his own journal. That had to be like a foreign world to him. Can you imagine being 22 years old, being in a different country, speaking the language, but then not only being in that country, but then joining a church of a completely different race and Christian experience. And he just takes it as an incredible blessing. I don't know how many people would. It's so many of our comfort zones and our feelings of safety are wrapped up in what is familiar. And Bonhoeffer, at this moment where he's away from home, encounters something in Christ in this community. You guys, Black history, African American history is our history. It's part of the history of the United States. It's part of our history as Christians, the suffering of our brothers and sisters. So, gosh, that was a foreign world to this aristocratic upper-class German. But Bonhoeffer found literally here a brand new way of looking at the world. That Harlem Renaissance was a communal transformation of consciousness, Dr. Williams says. Many of the new ideas and the theologies were new. And Bonhoeffer was hammering out a new theology, it felt like, on the fly. Excuse me. Human society, as you could, I think, was evolving in a glorious direction. The thinking went. This is what again, most white Americans and people in Germany, and the white race stood at the forefront. Right. If you don't know what social Darwinism is the idea that species evolve, that they become more complex, more capable by survival of the fittest. And if you take that idea, this idea of survival of the fittest and progression of animals, and you apply it to races, that's what's called social Darwinism. It was really popular in America in the 1930s, as you can see, and it was really popular in Germany, again, all over Europe, actually. This idea that the white race, just like some animals evolve and progress, that some races has it evolved further. And so even in those who think they're saying, that think they're being racially loving and tolerant during this time period, reveal that they have this intense white supremacy. Guys, I know you don't like that word. Maybe you don't. Have you seen presidential candidate Joe Biden? We know President Donald Trump is accused of being a racist, and I know all that. I'm not weighing in on this. But Joe Biden had a slip of the tongue last year where he said, you may have heard this sound clip, but he was caught saying that poor people are just as smart and just as capable as white kids. Did you hear that? So Biden, it was like a slip of the tongue, but he literally says, poor kids are just as capable as white kids. Right? It's so ingrained that it just, without even thinking, it could have been a minor slip of the tongue. And I'm not blaming Joe Biden, but you actually, during this time, during Bonhoeffer's life, you have a man named Josiah Strong. And he's a white liberal Christian who's supposed to be on the side of the black man. And what does he say? He says, the white race is callously exploits the lesser races. Right? He thinks this is liberal white theology in the 1930s in the United States. That the white race should be blamed for exploiting the lesser races. That's a quote. Right? This idea of white supremacy and superiority is so ingrained in us, even today, right, that two men can pull their shotguns, cut off a man, an innocent man, black man, shoot him dead, and go 3 months without being arrested, right? It's overwhelming. It's the assumption that because Ahmaud Arbery was black, these guys associated him with a criminal element, and he's dead. Dr. Williams says the Negro Church is the only church that has persistently opposed lynching, and the Negro pulpit is the only pulpit in America that unceasingly preached the brotherhood of man. If you're familiar with Dr. Martin Luther King, I know you are. His emphasis on the brotherhood and of all men is a consistent stream within the African American Church in the United States. The Harlem Renaissance that was unfolding all around the young Bonhoeffer was also during the worst economic depression in American history. It sparked what was called the Great Migration. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans from the South poured up into cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Harlem. A good friend of mine, Bruce Thomas, lived in Louisiana and came to California and moved to Watts in the 1950s. Because California was seen as this golden promised land. That great migration brought blacks to Harlem. They were hopeful, dreaming of a promised land. Imagine that Bonhoeffer's there in Harlem, in New York City, and African Americans are streaming from the South into Harlem. And a pastor named Powell said, the black experience of the church that is empowered by a black interpretation of Christ in the context of African American survival. Just a few more slides. Sorry, I'm going long today. The head pastor, Powell, at the church that Bonhoeffer attended, said, man needs to be done over. He said he cannot be done over until he is undone. My favorite Christian author is probably C.S. Lewis, and he wrote a book called The Pilgrim's Regress. It's the exact same idea that sometimes we are so far down the wrong path that we cannot just simply cut across to the right spot, that we have to actually backtrack and go back to where we got off track. I think if we just make assent, meaning we agree that yes, racism is awful, that really means nothing to mentally agree with it. And I don't think that's our vocation as Christians, is to just not like it or agree that racism is awful. But Powell, the pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church, and many other black pastors have emphasized that we cannot disconnect from the suffering world. And again, you might call this some theology gets to the point where it becomes like a social gospel, where that's all that we do, and that's never me. Anyone that knows me knows I'm not saying that the gospel is to help poor people. That's not it. Or suffering people. But when we look at such horrors like the Holocaust and Nazi Germany or slavery in the United States, that we as Christians should see a very clear call to act, to love, not just to agree that it's bad, to oppose it, to stand in solidarity with those who suffer, not to justify our positions of privilege. It's just as much our duty to get men and women positions of employment, right, if you can imagine, during this time, as it was to get them into the church. Right? Part of loving people, part of really being there and identifying in solidarity with people. It's hard to lecture someone on spirituality when he's hungry and out of work. It's like today, it's hard to get someone to care about global warming when they're so poor that they can barely feed their family. I've used global warming because I read an article that if you make less than $5,000 a year on the globe, you have no way you can even begin to worry about global warming. Right? You just have too many emergencies in your life to think about the effects down the road. And so part of getting people to think clearly and make better decisions is to address the desperate need that they're in, to really love them. It was an emphasis on lived faith, Dr. Williams says in the book, that shaped how Bonhoeffer understood that the church should be doing when the church struggled and when it began in Germany in 1933 when Hitler came to power. The tradition of Jesus, the co-sufferer, hidden in suffering, and the shame that Bonhoeffer encountered within the ministry in Harlem. The Renaissance literary movement remained with him when he returned home. I love that. The Bonhoeffer, who left Abyssinian Church in Harlem and returned back to Germany following that 1 year at seminary where he didn't like how liberal the seminary was, when he returned, the reaction of people to him and his teaching is overwhelming. People delighted. They were bewildered, these German Lutherans, by the way Bonhoeffer spoke and taught when he came back. When Bonhoeffer was in Harlem, he purchased a dozen recordings or so of African-American spirituals, and we know that he played them incessantly to the classes and youth groups that he worked with in Germany. The African-American combination of academic rigor and keeping the Bible, the evangelical message, simple, Bonhoeffer discovered in America, it really caught and struck his German audiences. One of Bonhoeffer's Berlin students recalled the directness and simplicity with which Bonhoeffer often asked his students whether they loved Jesus. The different Bonhoeffer was the one who would later speak out against Nazi racism and become the celebrated author of books like Creation and the Fall, Life Together, one of my favorites, Discipleship, and Ethics. If the basic thesis that Dr. Williams lays out in The Black Jesus, in Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, he stands up to scrutiny. American Christians must wrestle, I agree with this, with a close spiritual parallel between what the Nazis were treating, what they called Volkish racial purity, and the system we have and we have set up in the United States of what some would call white superiority. And it's not universal, it's not every person, and often it's in our institutions. I mean, we've had 40-some presidents, one was an African-American, every other one was a white male, right? And so I think we do have a call, and I'm hoping, again, it's a lot. I knew that this was a lot to get through, and so I was frustrated I couldn't get going on Facebook, but I do mean today that we are called as Christians to love our neighbors as ourselves, everyone. And when Christ came, he didn't just love those who were like him. Christ came and he reached out across racial lines. He reached out across lines of gender and social class. He identified with those who were suffering. When injustice is occurring, Christ is not on the side of the oppressor. I hope you can agree with that. And so because Bonhoeffer's experiences in New York City, in the United States, in Harlem, and he saw the expression and the growth of the black community in the Harlem Renaissance, but also the racial prejudice that still permeated so much of the United States. I hope that you can take this last paragraph in the way that I mean it. This is a direct quote from the book. I want to end with this. It says, "The German Völkisch devotion to pure German blood, with its ethnic, nationalistic, imperialistic longings, was the German equivalent of normalized humanity from the American version of white supremacy. Seeing society from the hidden perspective of Haarlem helped Bonhoeffer to recognize white superiority in Germany and to see it as a Christian problem that might demand Christian action. Because he was exposed to American racism from the perspective of Christians who were subjected to it, Bonhoeffer was equipped with prophetic insight that his white German colleagues in the church and the academy did not have." And that, in a nutshell, is why Bonhoeffer was able to empathize with Jews, was able to empathize with trade unionists and with homosexuals, why Bonhoeffer was able to empathize with the mentally disabled, the gypsies, and the rest of Hitler's victims. He had seen this before. I don't like to talk about race. I don't think racial division has any place within the church. Let me take that back. I know racial division has no place in the church or the kingdom of God. But I don't want to be a colorblind racist where I ignore the things happening around me. And I hope you aren't offended that I talked about Ahmaud Arbery. I still see in this country in 2020 a lower value placed on the lives of some of our brothers and sisters because of the color of their skin and the history of this country. And so we have a call, we have a vocation. Just like Bonhoeffer, his trip to the United States was to learn theology, and that's what he did, but it wasn't in seminary. He learned it in the context of Christians who had suffered, of Christians who were suffering, who saw Christ, and he finally saw Christ for who he was. Not an imperial king ruling over lessers, but someone who came and laid down his life and took on a role of a suffering servant. The entire Old Testament, many sections, refers to the coming Messiah as the suffering servant. If you've read Isaiah 53, he was cut off from the land of the living. He was despised. He was humiliated. Like a sheep before the shearers, he was silent. Again, he had nothing about him that would draw people's attention. And Christ came and lived the life of a lowly first century Jewish rabbi and was murdered by the Roman Empire. And later, Christians had found a way to twist Christ into the emperor on the throne, ruling over and justifying that sort of imperialism. Christ is not a black Jesus, and there is no white Jesus. There's only one Jesus Christ, and he came, and he incarnated, and he became a man, and all people can see themselves in him, their humanity in him. But when we see radical injustice, I think the Christian call, and this is just one example of the world we live in, we have this call as Christians to love, to really love in action. And I think if we are aware of the experiences of African Americans in the United States, of German Christians, and of those who have suffered, I really do believe that in a nutshell, Bonhoeffer's experience in the United States with the African American church allowed him to see truth, allowed him, like Christ, to empathize with Jews and trade unionists, communists, homosexuals, all these people. I don't like socialists, just joking, and communists, I get that, but Bonhoeffer is able to identify and empathize with them like Christ did. Again, this is a heavy topic for Mother's Day. I thought of vocation, and I really thought a lot this week about Ahmaud Arbery's mother and the reality of that injustice and the history that's led to that. And as a Christian, I feel a vocational call to love my neighbors, all of them, and to speak this truth. And so I hope, again, that you've been blessed. Next week, we'll continue to talk about vocation in the culture. I like and I hope you can see how each arena of our Christian vocation opens up doors into the other. So in our families, we learn the beginnings of the gospel. We begin to see examples of loving Christian relationships. We have people in our parents, hopefully, that love us unconditionally and continue to love us even when we fail. And then we become part of a church family, and within that church, we start to see our own individual skills and talents. I didn't know why I was made the way that I am. It didn't fit with the law career I was pursuing or any of the other things I did. But when I found my way into the body of Christ and found myself preaching and teaching and coaching and all the things I get to do, interacting with young people, simply loving them, listening, spending time, all these things I love to do, I found out actually who I was in Christ, what He had gifted me for. And now once you've found that in your church and you realize who you are, and I have this voice and I have a platform, and so I feel like my vocational call might not be the same for each of us, is to speak this truth. And so I hope you've been blessed today. I love you guys. I thank you for everything. Went a little bit long today, but God bless you. We'll be right back here on Facebook Live next week at 11 o'clock. Next Sunday. May God bless you and keep you. Make His face to shine upon you. Go out there and be a blessing to your mothers today. Moms, thank you so much for everything you do. We wouldn't be here without you. There's no doubt about that, literally. And thank you again for all that you do. We love you. Again, this has been Jimmy Chemist at Jesus Love Korean Church, and I'll see you next week. Thank you. Bye.